Oh, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here. I'm the panelist. I'm Alfari.
All right, great. Thank you. So all the BP rules apply. This is a top room, so I am going to assume we are all aware of the rules. I prioritize POIs and I love POIs. So I'm asking that you try to make the debate as engaging as possible by asking POIs and accepting POIs. Keep speeches to 7 minutes, 15 seconds. Anything you say past that time, I am not going to listen to. My panelist is also not going to listen to them. I'm going to be sharing my screen so that you can see the time, just so it's easier for everyone here. Let me get that done now. Just before that, let me be sure we all have the same motion. The motion has an info slide, super-aged society. I'm just going to read the motion. The motion says this house believes that super-aged societies should relocate a significant portion of pension funding towards subsidizing the living, living costs of new expecting families. All right. Great. So let me see. Sorry, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Chair.
Right. Sorry. Right. Can you see my screen now? Is this clear?
Yes, Chair.
Great. So, Prime Minister, we are ready for you.
All right, so before I start, okay, if you have a POI, I think it would be really fine to shoot in the 3rd minute. I think I'll prioritize so I can know what you're thinking. Okay. Okay, let me just okay. I think I have to set my own timer because I won't be really seeing what over there. I have my notes here. So I just set my timer here as well so I can be looking at it as you time it there properly. Okay. All right, so as I've written in the text space, I am Brian. I'm going to be PM and DPS joins early, but if it doesn't join, then I will be ironing in this round. Okay, so thank you. I start my speech. If I'm audible, I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, notice that this is not a policy motion. That means it is an advocacy motion to a higher extent, even if the worst case scenario exists on OP and it cannot win the debate if their if their alternatives does not significantly create a certain amount of value, given that this is a value motion. But also, even if in a situation of a small value realization on our side, it still doesn't mean that we can't win the debate because of the small values that probably exist on our side. We can still win the debate if the values are significant enough and if they are necessary in terms of magnitude also in terms of time and in terms of longevity and all that. I think the metric for judging this debate should be on the significance of value and in terms of longevity and magnitude. Thank you. So now, I think when we relocate significant portion of pension funds, it would mean probably 40% or maybe even 35% or something like that for subsidizing living cost of new and expecting families. Expecting families in such countries like Portugal and Italy currently have a lot of living costs and stuff like that. So in most cases, parents actually choose to do things like abortion because of their inability to afford living costs and also their inability to afford medical care and all these things. These are things that people go through, but also engaging demographic challenges that exist within these nations and all that. The worst that can happen is that the working age population reduces. So to a larger extent, sustaining the tax base for healthcare, infrastructure, and also the pension that OP will actually be arguing for, to a larger extent, will not be possible because with time, the population still reduces and all that. A case scenario, South Korea has an average age of 45.5. It increased from 31.5 to 45.5. That means, to a large extent, most of the population are retired people, and the ratio of retired people to working people is actually very high. That means the younger generation and the working population have to suffer high taxes and all this in order to sustain the pension and all these things. So leading to fiscal strains on health costs, debts, and all this. And then the tax base reduces and stuff like that. This is why countries like Portugal and countries like South Korea and Italy have to go and borrow a lot of money in order to sustain their growing population and all that. So creating situations like intergenerational inequality and stuff like that. So to a larger extent, it becomes very hard to bear such situations and conditions, creating a gap in things to do with social cohesion and stuff like that, because supporting families that are elderly and stuff like that consequentially becomes difficult and hard for the government and stuff. So I think it's my 3rd minute. If you have a POI, you can shoot before I proceed. CO. Okay. All right. So proceeding. The first argument we are running.
Sorry, I have a POI.
Yes, sure.
Okay, I think it's important to note that states with high life expectancy typically have high standard of living. So I think that's going to be important for you to note in your case.
Okay. All right, standard of living. Okay. Now, I think you have to notice that even if you believe that there is a high standard of living to a larger extent, we want us to believe that the strain on taxes and stuff like that still forces nations to probably go and borrow things like a lot of money and all this, because to a large extent, it becomes difficult to maintain the growing population and also afford their taxation and all these things. Yes, let's talk about the things to do with standard of living. Aggregately, you might argue that most of these individuals have high standards of living and all that, but we don't also forget that to a large extent, there is high unemployment rate in South Korea and also high unemployment rate in Italy and all these things. So it makes it worse for self-preservation and all these things. Now, the first argument we are running in this debate is the argument on self-preservation. We think it is highly likely for nations to actually self-preserve things like culture, preserving things like religion, and preserving things like life becomes easier if most of these pension fundings are relocated towards subsidizing things like living costs and all these things. To a larger extent, you have a healthier growing population and stuff like that, and you also reduce the tax burden that is largely contingent on the working population and all these things. So to a larger extent, you create a healthier working population, and also to a larger extent, you solve the demographic challenges that still exist within these populations. The population of white people reduced from 25 to 15%. So that already poses to a larger extent that there is some sort of demographic replacement because of the age of population and all these things, and people are having very low birth rate and stuff like that. And this is why most nations are opting for things like immigration and stuff like that. But most elites are fighting for things like increasing birth rates and maybe technologies like maybe giving birth through tubes and stuff like that, donation of probably spams and all these things are happening because there's some sort of low birth rate and stuff like that, low fertility rate and all these things. We think to a larger extent, if you do this, it gives the incentive for most people to probably go and give birth and all these things. Another reason why there's some sort of demographic replacement and demographic challenge is just because most younger people who are capable of giving birth and stuff like that are highly discouraged because of the living cost and all these things. That is why they most likely opt for things like abortion and all these things. If you divert or maybe you give a significant amount of funding towards living costs, to a larger extent, you incentivize them to do things like giving birth and all these things, raising the population demographic, creating a more healthier working population and stuff like that. Now, if we engage the idea of productivity, I think it's more likely on our side that you create a more productive generation because to a large extent, if you still allow these individuals to ride on pension and stuff like that, which you could quote as some sort of their right and all these things, without disposing a significant amount of that, you still increase living costs and stuff like that because the government would then have no alternative rather than taxing highly or borrowing a large amount of money to accommodate the huge population that is above age. Another thing that you have to engage is the idea of sustainability. To a larger extent, we think if you trade off this, you gain more significant benefits in the long run. If you believe that you have to support the elderly and stuff like that, and you think the standard of living is high and stuff like that, you also have to believe that in the long run, the standard of living will actually be worse off because you have less people working and more people depending on pensions. Thank you.
House thanks the Prime Minister for that fine speech. We now welcome the Leader of Opposition to begin their case.
Can someone hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, give me a second, please. Sorry.
Zeph, I would appreciate if you delete what you sent on the chat. I don't want people sending things like that. It's inappropriate. If you have anything, do it in your speech. Don't make any micro chats in the text space that is not appropriate, please.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Cool. All right. My payment preferences, I really don't have any. Just make them verbal. I won't be reading the chat. I might take them at any time, although I will call for one somewhere around the 5th minute. Preferably from closing. Yeah, I'll get my timer up and I will start on my next word. A few things in the speech. Just first, two calls out on like the framing, like two pieces, like they're just calling out two pieces of information on like the framing of the motion, getting into the negative impacts on older ones, why the state is failing its duty to these older ones, where it is they carry through this policy, and what their case misses out on, and like which causes them to fail in actually achieving the core objective, which is, and this is the first point, and like the first thing I'm calling out. They're sort of getting like families to produce more children or getting them to be more viable in society, and therefore sort of be more inclined to like prevent the aging of the population. The only way they get productivity on their side of the house is like, as per the motion, right, it says you're targeting expecting families in particular, is through causing them to have more children. That is like the extent of that is it, the only way they actually get to their impact. I'm going to be dealing with that later. The second thing, though, I want to call out is that I think they kind of downplay what counts as significant. They say 5 to 10%. This isn't significant. I don't think any reasonable intelligent voter would see that as a significant portion of pension funding. I would argue that at the very least, you're looking at maybe like 30%. Probably somewhere in the range of maybe half, if not most, of the pension funding. Like if it is to have any meaningful impact whatsoever, it has to be like significant to that degree. Else, like there's very little point in having this debate. The margins are just like too small, and it just kind of betrays, I think, the literal interpretation of the motion. We think then, firstly, what are the negative impacts on the older ones? Understand the significance of pension systems in these states. These are particularly wealthy states with fairly expansive social security networks. Like generally, it doesn't mean necessarily that each old person gets particularly much from the state, just that in proportion to how much they have in total, a lot of that must come from the state. They generally depend on like what the state is providing them with. There are three things then that the older one depends on, like where it is that they're retired and like can't work. It's either their own savings, it's either the state, or it's family. Why are their savings insufficient? Understand two things then. Firstly, there's a fairly high tax rate in the states, with disposable income largely taken for like the very same pension schemes that are like now like being sort of taken away from them. I.e., they don't have the kind of income oftentimes to sort of make the kind of investments in private insurance schemes or other things that would sort of provide for them later on, or like boost their savings such that they could maintain themselves later on. Secondly, then, is that there's an expectation that the state takes care of them because the existing framework of social security in most of these states have existed for some time. Meaning that they don't seek out other alternatives insofar as they expect provisions to be made for them, and you're betraying that expectation, which leads into the like second thing I'm going to like talk about. Why is leads to the next thing I'm going to talk about the state's obligation. But before I get to that, why does like family not apply either? Understand that in these secular societies, family structure generally isn't as strong. Either you don't have children, or if you have them, they probably don't live with you. They're probably not like in close contact with you. They're like probably not going to be providing you with the kind of funds to compensate for the state. And we think in the event that they do provide you with those funds, then you're essentially having the family pay for the older one anyway, just more directly, so there's no impact then. We think therefore older ones suffer. Why does this betray the obligation of the state? Firstly, note that these individuals would have paid taxes for this explicit purpose during their time of work. An express allotment towards pension funds is something that is oftentimes sort of like written into the tax code, where it's known where for the reason they're paying taxes is for it to go into these things, going to like something that provides for them later on. What it means then is that, importantly, a promise is made, a unique contract with the state that says, you work for me, you give me your money, I will give back to you. Not right now. What it means then is that where the state takes away this funding and betray this expectation that acted to the detriment of, that caused these old people to act to the detriment of themselves later on, the state is betraying a promise which they have an obligation to keep insofar as it like literally what I just explained right now. There's a legitimate expectation that they be cared for. We think, therefore, it's like a principled wrong for the state to do such thing, even if you buy the idea that there are productivity gains to be had. Understand then that the impact on older ones is likely to be very significant, and this is bad generally insofar as if you say, for instance, take 1/3 of the amount that they rely on and they have to pay food, medicine, and like rent, they're losing out on one of the three. One of the three is enough to severely sort of like deteriorate the conditions under which they live, if not outright kill them faster. This is grossly inhumane and immoral. We think then, even if you don't buy this case, we don't think you get the benefits that opposition talks about. I'll take a POI though before I move on.
So like these countries you're looking at are more stable countries where you're much more likely going to get stable returns. So it's just unlikely for you to say that the rates are going to be so bad. They'll make money on their investments and savings.
No. So like a lot of these individuals, okay, so yeah, you do have some portion that probably like makes money on their own, but I think in the majority of cases, because of the expectation of the state like providing for them, because of the generally high tax rates that exist, because of the lack of private alternatives, because of the state's monopolization of like insurance, like pension schemes, you don't have the same kind of like investment funds generally for the bulk of the population that allow them to sort of live off things that they've accumulated over their lifespan. It doesn't happen on scale necessarily. Moving on then to why you don't get the benefits that Gov talks about. I should have said that, my bad. Firstly, note there are a few things that cause individuals to not have children. We think there are like 3 reasons that are at play in these states. Firstly, the increase in women's empowerment, seeing like having children as being something that is now contingent on them receiving a certain kind of treatment, which they oftentimes do not get by the male population, but also like having children sort of placing them in a vulnerable position, which is sort of like unbecoming or betrays like the agency that they ought to have within the state. Something like then that is like not corrected under the system insofar as there is still that level of dependence to an extent, either on the state or on like the other person where it is you have children. That doesn't change. Secondly, we think individualism, and this is like probably the biggest thing, wherein individuals now find fulfillment and they find purpose from individual pursuits outside of things that involve family or children. family insofar as they prefer to exist without the kind of long-term relationships for a longer period of their life that are necessary to actually like have a family and have children. And then secondly, with fulfillment insofar as people have now found other means to like sort of satisfy themselves, found other things that they deem the purpose of their life, like work, like, for instance, like adventure, like I don't know, arguing with people on Discord or Zoom online at like 2 a.m., like that kind of thing. We think therefore these things which cause individuals to like to not like opt in to having children altogether are not going to change, and so giving them a bit more money probably isn't making that big of an impact. Lastly, I'll say though that Gov has failed to defend a key burden. Why pension specifically? Why not something like social securities or cutting military spending or just debt sourcing it if you expect significant returns? They don't defend why sacrificing old people is the way you actually get the required funding to make the kind of impact that they talk about. OG cannot win this debate. For those reasons, vote OO.
Yeah. House thanks the leader of UP for that fine speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue opening government's case.
Felix, can you please check your DM, like just a second?
Where, what's up?
Yeah, what's up?
Okay. Chair, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I have a lot to say, and I think I'm going to be speaking a little bit faster than I usually do, though speaking fast is like not my strongest suit. I do not expect anyone to budge. I think I'm just going to stop and take a point, I think, in the 4th or 5th minute, either of the two. Please don't budge. And I'm going to prioritize closing the point. So I'll start in my next word. Most states that have significantly rising aging generation have suffered significantly simply because there are low birth rates. The problem that comes with that is not just because the population is aging, or maybe just because people are not giving birth, because there are no incentives for people to want to actually have children. That is why very few people actually go ahead to have things like children and stuff like that. I think that probably explains why those particular things. I think there is a very big question that was posed. Why pensioners significantly? And for them, they think maybe you should take things from maybe social funding and stuff like that. The thing is, you can take money from these pensioners simply because all the social funding that goes into social services and stuff like that are things that these pensioners are going to benefit on, which means if you take a significant portion of that particular money, they don't suffer a lot. Why? Simply because you have invested in health, you have invested in agriculture, you have invested, you do not remove that money. That means they're able to benefit from those particular areas, and they do not suffer as much as they would. I think if you propose that we should only take from this particular side, there are significant harms. I think all loses on that simply because you cause more significant harm to a larger population within that particular country, and that makes it even more difficult because there is likely to be backlash if you remove money from things like health or maybe any other, maybe social services or social department that you want to take on. Like there are more significant backlashes that you are likely to get from that particular area. I think you do not engage or maybe win on that. I think the first thing that they say is that you betray the obligation that you have to these particular people if you significantly remove this particular portion of money from them. We think this is false. Why do you not, why do we say this is particularly false? Because as government, you owe an obligation to future generation, which is why government is able to hold parents accountable if they are not leading their children the right way. If you don't take your child to school, if you don't do this, they hold you accountable for that particular reason. What that means is that this particular government care about the generation to come. What that means is if you care about the generation to come in one way, you need to care about that particular generation in all ways. Later, I'm going to weigh why that even matters more than that. But for any other reason that is practical, you can likely even post that these particular people actually care about their children and their grandchildren. They would want this pension money to go into those particular things. I think that is something that will lead into things like productivity and continuity of that particular state. I think Brian hinted on that particular thing. Another thing that they post is that we fail to prove the significant portion. Panel, notice that if you have 100,000 and you take 35,000 from that, the 100,000 was not even enough or may not have been providing enough for these particular people. If I take 35,000, which is the 35% of this, I have significantly already reduced on this particular money, which was probably maybe not even enough in the first place. But even if that is not significant in OO's case, we think, I think my time is not moving. Even if that is not significant in OO's case, we think what we needed to defend is proof why doing this is important. The argument on whether this is significant or the strategy that Brian adopted or something is that I think doesn't matter, but I still think that the 5% is like pretty much significant amount from that particular pension. You don't have to remove all. OO needs to prove why we need to take 80% for it to be significant. So let's then engage on like quite a number of things that I probably want to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about is duty to future generation. Panel, notice that for every state to survive, they need to have a sustainable plan. That is to say, you need to have a plan that enables the country to continue and to rely on. Countries are only able to rely on things like workforce, on things like maybe leadership, on things like maybe improving the living situation. You're only able to do that when you have a productive generation. Productive generation comes from a generation that is able to work. The aging generation are not able to work. Already cited that. Because they're not able to work, you're able to relocate some of their money into the generation that is going to be more productive and is going to have a better workforce for the society. That particular generation yields for you sustainability, yields for you productivity. With all that, the aging generation are able to benefit from taxes that we get from these people simply because we are able to make them productive and we are able to tax them. Inability to tax the future, the elderly people makes it even like a worse investment. Let's then compare. Should we continue doing this in the way that OO is particularly saying? We say that yes, these people contributed to taxes in the past, but even when they were contributing to taxes, these particular people were being provided social services. You do not fail them simply because you are able maybe to relocate some of their fund, but also I already say that they actually are happy to actually donate this particular fund into this particular generation because they also care about continuity of the country. They care about their children and their grandchildren. I'll take CO. Okay, moving on. I think the next thing that I want to talk about is intergenerational justice. Panel, notice that for this particular state to particularly continue moving in this particular manner, it means that already there is an injustice. I already moved on. Already there is an injustice being done to the new generation. The problem with that is that everyone in the country will end up in the same place where the elderly generation are. What makes that even worse is because you continue to have fewer and fewer populations simply because people are not producing because of fear to probably maybe take care of these particular people like OO already told you. But the problem is the few population that remains end up into the generation that needs support, the generation that is aging or the age. The problem with that is that it becomes a disservice to the fewer population that remains behind because you put the entire workforce of the country on them, or you probably have to bring people or to bring people from other countries so that they're able to work for this particular country. You do an injustice to this particular population because they will be unable to particularly maintain this particular state to move on. For you to be able to have justice done, you need to relocate funding for these particular people, incentivize people to want to have children so that they're able to actually produce more productive generation that is able to push this particular country moving forward. I think we beat OO on sustainability question and productivity question. Vote OG. Thank you.
House thanks the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. To summarize the opening half of the debate, we welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I being heard?
Yes, you are.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two assumptions on OG. First, that this debate happens in developing countries, right? We're not talking about the vast majority of countries that exist in the global south that don't have this sort of economic strength and capacity of their citizens to sort of produce enough like for their children, right? We're talking about countries like Italy, Portugal, Japan that have very strong economies with people who are living very well, well dignified lives. So the extent to which they say a lot of children aren't being raised properly, and that will justify like giving them money, and then there's going to be more productivity for a lot of the people who don't exist in the population, we don't buy it, because the vast majority of these people that exist in these countries are already financially well off, and that is the next assumption that I will deconstruct. Here's the thing, OG doesn't prove the mutual exclusivity of like using pension funds for new families. The very flippant response they give us is that they benefit from other social safety programs. But the problem with this response is that they still don't tell you why these are likely to be effective. However, understand how most social programs are accessed by everyone, which means that the benefits are significantly minimal when everyone is getting a cut of the pie. On the comparative, pensions are more unique to the elderly and gives them more liquidity for economic and financial self-determination that goes beyond just subsistence like food, medicine, so they don't win on that. Why aren't people having children in the first place? Which is why we think that they don't win on incentivizing more people to have children in the first place, right? So 4 reasons why people aren't having kids. 1, it is a rise of individualism and selfish tendencies among people in these very advanced and developing countries, right? It is a case that currently there's a shift away from pursuing communal or familial interests like having a child to satisfy or please your parents or grandparents. But second, more women are becoming empowered and have traded narratives that tell them that children are important to their self-worth to narratives that tell them that that children prevent their social advancement and self-betterment, and that they prevent them from moving up the social ladder. But third, it's that like their financial stability as family units are no longer dependent on them having kids. So they no longer are going to have kids for them to be raised out of poverty. But the fourth reason is that children are no longer seen as fulfilling, but rather as liabilities to be constantly attended to, with the rise in aversion to things like commitment. Why then does this policy not work in incentivizing more people to have kids? Because the fundamental reasons why people aren't having children aren't motivated by cost of living, but more so by a personal and cultural shift towards less kids and being less responsible. So we're talking about, like, when we say things like the economy are already strong, which means there's high productivity, trade and investment, which makes their currencies and purchasing power strong. They don't suffer from extremely high prices, which deter them from having kids in the first place. This means that on the part of the policy, there's an assumption that people are going to have more kids if you subsidize their living costs. It assumes that people cannot afford to have children in these economies, which is empirically not true. Why then is this policy terrible for vulnerable older individuals? 1, because it takes away from their ability to meet their own subsistence needs if their money is being diverted towards newer families. This means that things like medicine, food, housing, recreation, and other important pursuits are lessened for these individuals. But let's scale this up. People with lower pensions are likely to be most impacted, assuming that a portion of their pension is taken away from them as opposed to people on higher pension schemes. What this is, panel, on principle, is that it is effectively theft. It is stealing from the most vulnerable to effectively incentivize people, to ineffectively rather incentivize more people to have kids. For this to be legitimate, they need to tell us why this pension fund is so important for incentivizing people to have children. They need to tell us why a pension fund is mutually exclusive to other alternatives. But the second reason why this is so bad is because it effectively instrumentalizes women as a means to an end for the state. It induces the most vulnerable women in society to use their wombs to contribute to statewide productivity and the replenishment of the population, as opposed to a genuine personal appreciation of the intrinsic value of having having kids. Why is this a bad thing? One, it creates a market of vulnerability for the state to profit from, because if the reason why people aren't having kids is because they don't live dignified lives and meeting their own subsistence, it means that state intervention was always possible but optional, so long as the state can use you as an incubator. This is bad because if we accept governments are responsible for protecting the vulnerable as an obligation of the state, incentivizing a market of vulnerability is bad and fundamentally a manifestation of governments defaulting on this obligation. What then is our comparative? We think that government should launch social campaigns that encourage women to altruistically have children based on messaging that talks about the unfavorable outcomes of not contributing to population growth. So things like elderly care becomes terrible, things like productivity, investment, and the economy become worse, are promoted as important things to try to protect. We think what's better is a campaign based on the internal will to have children that is motivated by an altruism, as opposed to a market of vulnerability that the government taps into. Why is our alternative better? One, we don't profit from the vulnerability of those having kids, like really poor women, right? But the second thing we tell you is that we directly motivate people through our personal responsibility for the collective, which serves as a countervailing narrative to all the social narratives that tell people not to have kids. Only OO accounts for this through psychosocial messaging that attempts to make people more responsible for the regeneration of the population. We've told you the vast majority of these countries are already economically well off. They need to prove why in places like Portugal, Italy, Spain, in Japan, that people are living in so much poverty, right? That this pension fund, that poverty is disincentivizing them from having children in the first place. I'll take your POI.
Like, why is giving people incentive not altruistic? Because social campaigns are, you're going to get profit from them in the long term.
Yeah. So what we tell you is what it means for the government to tap into a market of vulnerability based on economics, right? It means that you could be in a position to help these people otherwise, but you do it based on women's ability to instrumentalize their own wombs as incubators to bring forth people to contribute to the productivity and the economic profitability of the state. We tell you why our alternative is far more altruistic and countervails the social narratives that mostly disincentivize people from having children in the first place. If this is true, we have more children on our side, they have less children on their side, because the vast majority of reasons why people aren't having kids in places like Portugal, in places like Japan, isn't because of money, it is because of social factors and narratives that deter them or disincentivize them from not having kids in the first place. Vote OO.
House thanks the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. This brings us to the end of an amazing top half. To begin the bottom half, we welcome the Member of Government.
Hi, can you both hear and see me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. For POIs, just give me a second. For POIs, just like unmute, I will take you. I will try to be as charitable. Opening opposition did take me. But probably I'll try to prioritize like CO, but yeah, just the POI, you know? Okay. Just let me get my notes. I'm also running an external timer chat, so just yeah, I'll follow this too, but I typed my notes. So I'm gonna start this debate in 3, 2, 1. The CG extension is going to be simple. The CG extension is going to be twofold. One, on a principled idea on why the principle of reciprocity is important. And I think this specifically answers the whole OO chat as to duty that came out of ELO. But two, the productivity chat. Because like, I know, ultimately, like what happened in the top half is quite important. Like we're just going to give like better analysis and like you will see when the extension unfolds. But I think the important things on setup to clear up. How do pension funds actually work? Government gives a specific corporation or a specific portion of the incomes to corporations. So when pay as you are, you give some money to the pension, you give some money to a fund, government ultimately invests more in that fund. So usually a lot of these funds invest in things like government bonds in stock markets that are much more long-term or give stable returns. The second thing I want to clear up is what are these super-aged societies and why do they live longer? CO is right. They live longer because of high standards of living, high social adaptation, and all these different things. First part I want to clear up also in setup is why does this not harm ultimately aged societies? Because I think the policy debate ought to get it wrong. why do you not harm these age societies? A couple of reasons here. I think one, a lot of the countries we're looking at are much more developed countries that have stable rates and stable investments because you invest in much more long-term bonds. This is important because when all say that your savings aren't going to yield you anything, they're just plain as lying. Why? Because countries like Singapore, countries like South Korea have much more stable rates. And this is important because even when you have less money, you're much more likely going to get stable returns. And this is important because super-aged people don't have large ones. So ultimately, they simply want to leave a lot of money back for their children. The second thing here is that even how they take out the payments, I want to be very clear here. Most people don't take out their retirement payments in the large sum. They take out their payments through small monthly payments. It's important because they also want to pay taxes. Why is this crucial? It's crucial because they are unlikely going to be productive in the long, even in the short run. It's also very important because even if we take 20%, they are still able to give them money. Because if you're not taking out large sums of money and you're living longer, you don't need that money immediately. That money is much more likely going to yield the benefits that we get right now. Thirdly, I think the nature of the societies are just that people take care of their older populations, but you can still rely on family. So, like literally, like or lie. But I think the most important thing also here is to know that why are the education systems and everything good? Because the younger generation are taxed. Secondly, what does this allocation look like? Just think it looks like you increasing the amount of like giving people stuff to give birth. But most importantly, what are these living expenses and what are the new expecting families? Couple things here. One, this is, for example, why you provide education scholarships. It's all lie to you. But in countries, people who are older are not taxed heavily. The people who are taxed heavily are you people who are between 20 to about 35. This is your expecting population. These are the people who are trying to grow. Not, you don't want to have children because it's insanely expensive to have children. Because things like healthcare, things like free care are very expensive. Not, this is where we significantly subsidize a lot of these things. What have I done up until now? One, dispelled the claim on OO that you just don't want to have kids because of the social aspects. Because what? Even social aspects are driven by economic factors and economic circumstances. Lots of people want to have huge amounts of money. It is difficult to have a child. It's more likely going to trade off and be the capitalistic society. Not when you create incentives, it is good. Also lie and say use more social campaigns. I don't understand why social campaigns are more altruistic and why we provide people commercial incentives. It's not altruistic because you simply get the choice. You could have those children, you could not have those children. I think this is important because it answers a couple of things. One, always lying because the tax rate on the people here who are younger, the large and expecting people, is largely a lot. But I think Zephyr will answer most of these things. So I want to dive into the extensions here. First is in the principle of reciprocity. I would like to posit here that it's just very untrue that the elder population in these societies are very most vulnerable. Note, what is it to be vulnerable? To be vulnerable is to be very difficult for you to take care of your livings. Note, a lot of these countries have a super-aged population which succeeds because of the high standards of living. This is true because the people are just not vulnerable. They pay less tax, they pay less taxes. But second, a lot of the medical systems are adapted to them to benefit them ultimately because a lot of people are old. This is true because, again, like the Infoslide says, most importantly, I think this puts out two things. One, that the most vulnerable are actually living people, are actually the people who are expecting. Why? Because taxes are high. You have mortgage bills, you have phone bills. But secondly, you're also living within a capitalistic society which doesn't give you the ability to grow. Largely because you have a super-aged society, a lot of the tax burden is on these people. So they're actually the most vulnerable people. Note that in terms of the principle of reciprocity, with those who are more vulnerable than us. Because comparatively, the older generation now benefited from taxes of the people who are younger. They were also taxed. This is why the whole obligation from OO is centered on you repaying that reciprocity. Not, I'm being able to prove to you that these people who are living and expecting are more vulnerable because of their taxes. But most importantly, because they live in a very society that is trying to and they're still trying to consistently make money. This is important because it shows a couple of things. One, don't think we circumnavigate the obligation to duty. In fact, I think the obligation is far much more strengthened when you're able to provide a reciprocal point of view where you're able to benefit one another. Because ultimately, as the young get taxed, that tax helps improve the education system. So it helps improve the health systems which ultimately better the older population. Because ultimately, you're much more likely going to live older. For that, a POI from OO. I just want to get to the second argument. But 3,
Yeah,
2,
so who are the people who are taking these incentives? The poor and most marginalized. It proves that you have the money to help them all along, but instead you dangle it above their
no,
heads for them to instrumentalize their own bodies to help the state. That is grossly immoral.
It's that if a lot of the money is really putting into developing healthcare systems to better the super-aged, you also need to better those systems for much more younger populations. Just don't think that is true, but therefore I'll handle it. The second argument is I want to explain why you are much more likely going to get productivity. I know all you say this, but a couple of things are unclear. Why are you more productive? Why is there a guarantee? And what is the comparative? Two levels of analysis here. One, note that a young and more expecting people have much more current needs. So they're actively spending. So their disposable income, when you increase it, they're spending on things like diapers, on things like healthcare immediately right now. Comparative, a lot of the more aged population psychologically want to leave money for their children. So they spend less. So the impact here is twofold. When you invest more and reduce and subsidize the living of the people who are expecting and young and want to have children, there is more economic growth, which actually incentivizes investment. Why? Because aggregate demand increases because more people are trying to spend money. Comparatively, if you keep that money in the older generation, who already told you, I'm not taking it at once, I'm taking it in small bits. You still keep that money stagnant and you don't get any economic development. On our side, the impact is much more likely going to strengthen economic development. But I think lastly, you get a much more youthful population. What have I done? I've explained a couple of things. Principle on why reciprocity is very important. Two, I've shown you the reasons why the younger population is much more likely going to benefit you and be more productive. Vote for CG.
House thanks the member of Gov for that fine speech. We now welcome the member of opposition to begin closing opposition's case.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes. Yes, you are.
Okay, just give me a second. In terms of your why, we need to stop at some point. But aside from that, you can ask. My network can be a bit shaky, so if you like ask once and I hear you, just be quiet, I'll get to you eventually. All right. But at any point, Chair, you can't hear me, please reach out to my partner on the call and she'll be able to reach out to me. Okay. Okay then. This is going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, a couple of things come to mind when you think about this motion. Pretty basic things. This is a belief motion, which means aside from utility, the question on truth of the motion still remains. That's the low birth rate of countries in these countries in the first place. And if it is a money problem, does government claim fix that particular money problem in its instances? No gov team has answered this particular question. Why are there low birth rates in this country? The first thing is we don't think it's a money problem, because given that we can have high birth rates in third world countries like Nigeria, we think it's possible to have them in these particular countries because they're not necessarily third world countries. We think a couple of things. Number one, your boss does, it means that people have to be staying in the workplace up to late hours. Yeah. Yeah.
So your network is deceiving me. I'm trying to tell you sometimes when it stops, then you just continue. So the last part I got from you was the part about, if we have these things in third world countries like Nigeria, then it's possible that you have them in these places. I would appreciate if you would just start your speech because it's not been clear so far.
Yeah, let me turn on the Wi-Fi. Chair, am I audible?
Can you read the motion, please?
This House believes that super-aged societies should relocate a significant portion of pension funding towards subsidizing the living cost of new/expecting families. Is this good?
Yes, this is good. Proceed.
Okay. Starts now. Mr. Speaker, a couple of things come to mind when you think about this motion. This is a belief motion, which means aside from utility, the question on whether the motion is true is one that still remains. It means that the first thing for you to interrogate when you're thinking about this motion is whether if it's even in its instance what causes low birth rates in these countries, if it's a money problem or a cultural one, and if it's a money one, does the government proposal pose the best way to practically fix this problem? No government team has answered this question. Why do we think there are low birth rates in these countries? The first thing to say is that we don't think it's a money problem. Given that we can have high birth rates in countries like Nigeria, we think it's possible to have them in these particular countries, which means it's a culture thing. How does this culture thing appear? Couple of ways. First, on the work culture, it means firstly that there are extreme hours within these particular countries, a collective ideology that you don't leave the work until your boss leaves. It means that it's more likely or less likely to even have active parenting even if you have children. The second thing is on the social stigma that comes with this particular action. We think in most of these countries, even while parental leave is like up to a year, people are most likely not going to take that. Women are most likely going to take that because they feel as though this thing is going to affect their ability to have a promotion, leading to a generation that necessarily don't want to give about kids, don't want to give birth to kids, or don't even want to date in the first instance. The second thing is on the child rearing culture. There's a cost of excellence within these particular countries. I mean, there's a need for your child to not just exist, but to exist in a very high standard that they can compete with all these private schools and compete for universities and etc. We think that the housing in most of these countries are really whack because the opportunities are concentrated in states. It means that you are going to find couples who are living in like boxed apartments. Where exactly are you going to have children in these particular places? We think the lack of basic amenities within these states make it very, very impossible. Things like low wage, high rent, etc. It means that most young adults are going to live with their parents up until their 30s, which pushes the time that they're going to have for love or marriage or even consider children in the first instance. We think that things like youth unemployment, young people are just bouncing around within short-term jobs, and that is even if they can find one in the first instance, it means that it makes it impossible for you to plan for a family. This is why these things exist within these particular countries. Why do we think this is very, very important? We think number one is a problem-solution mismatch on the first basis. We think number two, it's a show of fiscal irresponsibility because basically you are destroying a functional system, which is pensions, to fund an experimental one, subsidies. Because notice, none of the guys from Gulf teams, because they lacked this question, they didn't interrogate how the incentive changes. If I give you more money, does that mean you're going to suddenly have more time, or does that mean you're suddenly going to have all these cultural reforms that are going to make you want to have kids? We think second is going to be a sense of economic drag because you're moving money from retirees who are always constantly spending their money on things to young families who are more likely going to save them because they want to provide or want to prepare for a future. It means that the money flow within the country is going to be very limited. Why do we think this is bad? A couple of things. Number one, it's going to be an economic double failure. We think that you now end up with a society that still has low birth rate, but now has a massive impoverished elderly population. We think that's entirely very harmful. Secondly, you're going to have an increased burden on the youth because ironically now, because the elderly are now poor, and the new families will have to spend their subsidies taking care of their own parents. It means as a child, I have to take care of my parents from the money that the state gives me to build my own family. We think that's a zero net gain. Yeah. The third thing, they're going to have a certain level of market distortion. Notice, panel, this economics, the sudden influx of cash into family sectors without increasing the supply means they are going to have localized inflation. It means that the marketing or the housing market is going to increase the price to match that particular subsidy, which means at the end of the day, you solve no particular problem. The alternative here is very simple. If government is passionate about setting the birth rates to normal, they can see things like invest in supervised IMF, young workers imports. They're going to create better labor laws, allowing couples the flexibility to have children. They're going to engage in things like cultural and social engineering to encourage people to give birth. We think these alternatives exist, and we don't think government interrogate these particular things. The second thing from closing opposition is on the chart of social contracts that you get from OO. But the extent they took it just to tell you that it's immoral and the state owes these elderly people. They don't explain the mech as to why the state owns these people and what happens when you break the social contract. Why do we think it's a fundamental breach of the social contract? 3 reasons. Number one, it's retrospective injustice. These guys have already paid their dues through decades of taxes and working for the state. Taking that money now is a retroactive tax on their lifetime of work, which they cannot redo. They can't go to work again. They can't redo this particular action. The second thing is on the inability to adapt. It means that unlike young people, these retirees, they can't go back to work or change their financial strategy to compensate for a sudden loss of income. Notice their intent here. It's sudden. The third thing here is the legal and moral certainty. Most people make their life choices, saving, insurance, housing, based on the guarantee of a pension. It means that when you remove the reliability of,
Okay, According to UN, 60 to 70% of people do not want to give back because of economic challenges. But still, even your case doesn't deal with the physical challenges that you still have, like tax and all that on the younger working population.
Here's how debates. Sure. Here's how debates work. We are here to prove that you are wrong. I don't have to solve the problem. Don't try to push that burden on me. And the alternatives I already gave you are things that can already work to solve that problem. I'm not here going to interrogate that. Like on the legal and moral certainty, it means that when you take away these pensions to give to the young people, what then is the incentive for the young people to work for the state or to work at all till they are old, knowing that this particular work that they are deserved is something that's going to be taken away from them? Government bench don't interrogate this thing. I think on an economic level, are going to bring down the downfall of the state. Why do you think it's important? Two things on state legitimacy. It means that if the state can break its most sacred promise to the most vulnerable people, what then is the basis to trust that the new subsidies promised to them won't be taken away in 40 years? Second thing on this is on social peace. We think that when you cut things to the elderly, you're basically pitting the elderly against the young people. You're basically pitting children against their parents. We think that is a fundamental attack to the most basic form of society, which is the family. We think that's entirely very harmful to government's case. We think that's very entirely harmful to the state or even to these young people in that particular instance. What is the impact of government states here? Couple of things. The first thing is on political instability. It means that, panel, the elderly, who are the most active voters, will lose faith in the democratic institutions, which means, panel, it's going to have a lead into the radical populist movement. We think this is very, very harmful because notice that most young people essentially don't very, very active politically. It means in the instance that you take this action, you're basically turning the elderly against the state. We think that's very harmful. We don't think we want a state where they have these levels of political instability because on the long run, it's going to affect the worker base. It's going to affect things more than just the politics. Politics is basically the backbone of every state. The second thing here is that it signals that private property and end benefits are subject to the whim of demographic trends. Notice that the low birth rate is a demographic trend. It means that even if you work, even if you do everything within your power to get whatever you want, just because the major population has a certain idea, there's a tendency of that to be taken away from you. It means you're going to discourage long-term investments in the long run. The last thing here is that it's going to increase mortality. People are going to die more. More importantly, the elderly people are going to die more. We think that's very, very harmful. We don't think in the case where we can prevent death among the 65 plus demographic, that we shall allow those deaths to happen in that particular instance. Was in opposition.
House thanks member of UP for that fine speech. A reminder again that anything you say past 7 minutes and 15 seconds, I won't be listening to. We now welcome the government whip to summarize government case.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll be prioritizing OO in the debate. I'll be asking for a POI around my 5th minute. Oh shit. Let me just take a moment to put my notes together. Okay. I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, let's exit out of this debate 3 claims. 1, if people in developing countries can have children, then it's not a financial issue of whether or not having children. But no, the cost of living in developing countries is insanely low. That is to say, you can raise a family on subsistence farming. You can all live in one room. You will not get laid off because of AI structures and systems. The bar for success is inherently low. Those are not the bars placed in developed countries. 2, the argument that money is used as an incentive. Not that 1, their model consists of offering workers benefits and rights, etc., to have children. Therefore, by their own model, their system is coercive and forcing people to have children because of established benefits. But 2, I think this is inherently a logical fallacy. On our side of the house, people already want to have children. They want that legacy, they want that family, they want that community, etc. It's an innate desire for a person to want to have a legacy. We think at that point in time, all they're incapable of is affording a child a piece in the puzzle that we are fulfilling. And I think that third is this idea of fissures of the young against the old. But no, I'm going to mechanize this better later, but the wealthy in status quo are already economically established, as was considered by like OO. Everyone has considered that this debate happens in wealthy countries, and therefore the old people are likely to have accrued the most benefits from these wealthy structures. But I think secondly, if you concede to the fact that younger generations need to be financially supported in order to have children by your model of include better like worker rights, etc., it means that there is a fissure then existing between the young and the old because of the young being like systematically poorer or disproportionately poorer than the older population. If the young then decide to revolt at the government, it's worse because they're the ones who are most likely to inflict the most damage in regards to riots, protests, etc. CO is out of this debate. Let's handle OO, they have the better case. One, older generations are experiencing a level of financial insecurity. Pano, they've already considered that these countries are well off. Two important things to consider. A, older generations in these countries tend to be the wealthiest. The income divide between the youngest and oldest generations in these countries tends to be quite wide. Why is this true? Most of them tended to buy their assets before the recent recession. So looking at the COVID recession, the housing crisis, etc. A lot of these people were alive at a time where houses were infinitely cheaper and inflation was far less. That means they aren't in the loan culture of rent payments. They aren't making car payments. They don't have to focus on daycare. They don't even have to focus on raising their kids that much because they didn't even have to focus on college debt that much because college rates had like inflated to that extent. That means even if the older generation is not the most comfortable generation, the younger generation is disproportionately in a worse situation just because of the amount of things that they have to subscribe to in order to have a decent way of life. I think because the younger generation are the ones experiencing layoffs, the ones who are harmed by the housing crisis in 2008, the ones going through recessions, the relatively harsh situations, the younger generation is then more entitled to being supported. But I think too, a good portion of their pension funds and systems remains. That means for the older generations who are significantly disproportionately aided, such as perhaps homeless people or veterans who could not re-enter the home market, these people are going to be helped. The most vulnerable people in the older generation are going to be aided. But if you're to look at countries such as the US or Canada, whereby the wealthiest people tend to be in the largest elder bracket of the population, I think they're exaggerating the extent to which old people struggle. To the idea of a problem-solution mismatch where they have this entire case on individualism being the reason why people aren't having children. One, this is generally false. I think the sharp decline in decreases having kids has not been directly proportional to individualism in society. What do I mean? Individualism has existed from the previous century. From the 1950s, people are spreading narratives in feminism and whatnot and the whole revolution movement. People are consistently saying that we want to be individual and we don't want to have kids. It did not affect the child crisis. What did? It happened in countries such as Japan, whereby people started receiving more and more disproportionate work and far less pay. It happened in places like North America when the housing crisis cropped up in like the 2010s to the 2020s. That's when we saw a sharp decline in these situations. Individualism has existed from time memorial. However, current problems in status quo are what are forcing people to not have children. That's empirically false. And I think too, the idea that state is using women as incubators, I think this is drastically false. Once again, we've already argued that people want to have kids. People want to involve themselves in procreation for legacy, for community, etc. That means that most of the time, state is just offering people this further extent of access to have children. And I think lastly, I don't think OP is taking very seriously the idea of what a decrease in childbirth actually looks like, especially when James gives you all this analysis on why economies consistently have to be supported and financially injected into in order for state to have a more sustainable structure that is for economies to thrive. You can't have a sharp decrease in population because then literally economy sectors can halt. You don't have enough jobs. People have to shut down. People move out of that country in order to get a better like economic market, etc. Such as is happening in Japan. That's why everyone is working on getting people to be incentivized to have children. It generally fucks up your economy. I think before I deal with the last clash, is there a POI? Okay,
Yeah, so
let's
two
handle
things.
this chat.
Firstly,
Yeah.
Yeah, the old generation having their own issues does not at all negate the expectation that we talk about that creates the contract. And secondly, what happened in like countries that have a declining birth rate is a sort of rise in secular culture. I don't see how you prove that this isn't a correlative factor, at least a
No, I
causative.
think that's vastly incorrect. The reason as to why people stopped having children was because of housing crisis, etc. It wasn't because of individualism. As I've told you, they don't provide you actual analysis as to why individualism is true. They just rant on about feminism, etc. I think that's inherently a lie. The last thing I'm waiting out of this debate is this chat of like state obligation, etc. I think the social contract is true in that you have to ask people like, give support to the state, they have to aid them. But one, notice that there's a general shift in the social contract. That is to say, because this is a model in and of itself, younger people in status quo are not going to receive a pension as much when they are older. That is, there's an extent to which they're going to let go of their rights and their justification to a pension in order to receive it now, because this is probably going to be a long-term model of 50 to 100 years. Therefore, as an individual, I'm receiving money now in order to facilitate me having children, and that's something that I'm going to pay off, and when I'm older, I'm less likely to receive a pension because I received it earlier, but because I'm put in a better financial state. That is A. B, older generations are not the strongest tax base. That is to say, a vast majority of the assets they have, they accrued at an earlier age. So they're not contributing that much to state anymore. They are not putting in that much effort into state and into the structures that generate a profit. That means that the people you ought to be focusing the most on in regards to helping them facilitate their actions in the economy are the younger generation. The harm, however, that happens is is younger people tend to be inflicted by the housing crisis. Large amount of rent prices. An apartment in New York being $4,000 for one of the cheapest places, etc. You're looking at cases whereby people can't afford food. The grocery crisis happening in the United States. Notice how the vast majority of people who complain about the harsh economic structures are people like millennials or Gen Z, because they do not have access to the structures that older populations tend to have. So that's the main concession. Even if an older person isn't living in the clouds or living in like a spa, a younger person is disproportionately going through much worse in regards to debt and struggles, etc. The likely generation, sadly, however, to be growing economies is still the younger generation. Therefore, you ought to help measure in them highly in order to ensure that they have the highest amount of income and the highest level of sustainability. What's the most important thing to take in my speech? Or can't run away with this claim that that countries in these places tend to be financially good and financially strong, etc., generally ignoring general knowledge about the harms of the COVID recession and housing crisis in these regions, while simultaneously claiming that in a wealthy country, all people are disproportionately harmed and therefore don't have income. I think that's generally a lie. All people have always been the most established people in status quo. With that, I rest.
House thanks the government whip for that fine speech. Summarize what has been an interesting debate. Welcome the opposition whip.
Am I audible?
Oh yes, you are audible.
Okay, I need 1 minute. I begin at 9:04. Let me just set up my timer. My laptop turned off, so I have to turn it on. So I'm taking time myself.
Opposition whip, your 1 minute is up.
Okay, I'll just begin anyways. In terms of POIs, wait, let me take off my head. Okay, in terms of POIs, I'll prioritize opening government. Just give me a second. I'll count you down personally. Okay, wait, let me put it in loudspeaker so I can also hear in case there's a POI. Relax. Ocha, could you say something? Let me see if I could hear you. If I can hear you.
You've delayed for quite some time. You should start your speech.
Oh, sorry. Technical issues and all of that. Okay, yeah, my pronouns are they, them. Please respect my pronouns. Please put POIs in chat. And yeah, I begin at the countdown of 3, 2, 1. Panel, plunder is morally abhorrent. Reducing significant portion of old individuals' pension is plunder. Denying them the right to their dignity of labor, denying them the returns of their years of paying taxes. We think this is very disgusting in and of itself, and we are very happy to stand in opposition. I'll talk about 3 things in this whip speech. 1, I'll talk about the principle. 2, I'll talk about population control. And 3, I'll talk about the sustainability and reception of this policy. Firstly, on the principle, OG and TG argue sustainability on how this is principally just because it is sustainable for a vast majority of the working force that exists within that particular state. We think there's 2 problems with this. The first is that they don't show you how other alternatives cannot work. And given I'm going to explain and mechanize the alternatives in my second substantive, it means then we cannot credit them the exclusivity to their side. But then secondly, if we can prove that it is not even sustainable extensively, we think it's just principally abhorrent to enact this kind of policy within this particular state. We think OO and CO is able to win on on the principle, because we both prove that this is plunder, taking all of the returns that these people are supposed to deserve because they've worked for so many years within that country. There's a social contract that the government is supposed to fulfill because these individuals have paid taxes, and that pension is a reward for those taxes, for those labors, for those laws that they followed over the course of their young years. It means then in any instance the state decides to significantly reduce any amount of this portion of taxes, regardless of the degree that OG and CG argue, it is principally abhorrent, and it is independent of any practical outcome, because insofar as the process is unjust, we say it is principally abhorrent in and of itself. Second thing I'm going to talk about then is on population control, and this becomes very important because it forms the core of OG and CG's case. What do they tell you? Opening government tells you that our world causes a strain on taxes for young people with the growing old population. Closing government adds to this by saying the workforce is the most vulnerable since they are the ones expected to pay higher taxes. There are three responses to this from CEO that wins us this clash. I think the first is that it ignores the economic reality within this state. Majority of these states, they have high life expectancy as detailed by the Infoslide. And expectancy means there is a high standard of living within that country. This is crucial because for a state to attain high standard of living and high life expectancy, it means there is a large chain or pool of resources to which it can continuously help its people for decades and for even as long as centuries. It means the country can be sustainable enough to enact certain kinds of mechanisms to protect itself, to incentivize population control, to increase that population, and to also guarantee that people are not strained by excessive taxes. They don't engage this because we asked this in a POI, and that was very problematic. But the second thing here is that there are ways to incentivize people to give birth and to just solve all the problems within this debate. Justice tells you four things. One is that you can invest in supervised IVF because in the vast majority of instances, people don't have the convenience because they're always continuously working within the state. It means that if you can conveniently invest in this IVF, people can be more conveniently giving birth within those states. I'll take you in a second. But secondly, you can have young workers immigrating to that country because notice if you have a deficiency in labor, they never tell you why you can't get the immigration of young workers. People have proven that they are skilled within other countries, other foreign countries, to come into your country and fill up the workspace. And this is going to be crucial because at least on the short term, you are able to garner support, you are able to garner workforces that can implement certain kinds of things you need within the corporate field while you solve the long-term problems within your country. Right? Thirdly, you can enact better labor laws to allow couples the flexibility to bear children. Because notice in countries like Portugal, long working hours prevents this flexibility. So people have very little amount of children because they have little amount of convenience or time because they are always working within the corporate firms, etc. In a world where we enact proper labor laws, it means people have more flexibility, people have lesser working hours, and more wages, meaning they can have more time and more convenience to bear children. If you take away this strain by enacting better labor laws, it means people have the decency and the temerity to have more children. But fourthly, and very importantly, cultural and social engineering to encourage people to give birth. Because if people are encouraged to give Relax, I'll take you. Because if you can encourage people to give birth, both socially and culturally, that is to say, all of the problems that cause people to take some sort of empowerment stance. For instance, now, women's rights within countries like South Korea, if we can tend to those issues, we can decide to give birth again. All of those social and cultural issues that cause people not to give birth, if you can solve all of it, or at least tend to it, to appeal to the broader population, it means they have a cultural and social incentive to continue giving birth. These mechanisms are important for three key reasons. Firstly, it's important because OG never tells you why redirecting funding is the only way, meaning they never prove why any other mechanism to incentivize birth is not going to work. But secondly, meaning that you have to buy these mechanisms insofar as it has been refuted in the positive matter of any gov team. Thirdly, then, through these mechanisms, we can get individuals and workers fill up the workspace and get productive on the short term while we implement long-term solutions to encourage individuals to give birth more and stabilize the population. This means that the taxes never get strained insofar as you can get young people to work within your country from other countries, and hence these young people that exist within your country, they never get past the threshold of taxes that they can never endure. But thirdly, and very importantly, it solves the structural issues that prevent people from giving birth in the first place, meaning it approaches the problem at the core instead of the short-term solution that OG and CG defend. Before I talk on the flip of this argument, I'm going to take a POI.
Okay, if you think they are always working, they can always increase working hours because of the few working population. But also, if you think you have to rely on other mechanisms to incentivize giving birth, you also have to believe 70% of people.
Sorry, I didn't get that. My network is funny. Sorry, I didn't get your POI. My network is very, very funny. Wait, pause my time. Am I still audible? Wait, pause my timer. Am I audible?
Yes, you are still audible.
Okay, I'm very sorry I could not get that POI. You cracked on my end, but I'll just continue anyways. I resume. Relax. Where am I? Okay, cool. I resume at the countdown of 3, 2, 1. Okay, the next to say under the premise of population control is that justice is able to flip this argument in his member speech. He tells you that on government side of the world, there is no incentive for people to work hard and pay high taxes when they know that in the future, the government will deny them of their pension. This essentially means 3 things. 1, it's less likely that this policy will be accepted by the public insofar as everyone gets affected by it at one point later in life. But secondly, we think it garners distrust and continuous pushback against the government. Many people are less likely to obey the government and kids, but secondly, the government just loses legitimacy from the public, which expands exponentially to different policies that the government tries to pass. But thirdly, it proves that even if you give workers more money, you can never solve the key problems that causes low birth rate within the country, but rather you antagonize the general public against the government. Open opposition never provides all of these mechanisms, and we think CEO adequately and uniquely solves this problem that OJ and CG has. Let's talk about sustainability. The last thing here, CG says old people have stable rates and stable investments. OJ says that old people savings are sufficient. We think 3 simple responses that wins us this debate. 1, they assume that every old person has investments, not varies from person to person. But secondly, it assumes that investment always brings substantial returns. No, some investments fail. But thirdly, resources are finite. Since there's no study flow of income, since they are no longer working, it means these resources can adequately finish at one point in time. But lastly, people that are poor, the poorest old people, they suffer because they need all of this to self-sustain, to manage themselves. And we think this is very crucial. For all of these many reasons, CO.
House thanks the opposition for that fine speech. This brings us to the end of